Hello, my name is John Fowler. I'm Professor of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University. I'd like to spend a few minutes today talking to you about an Excel tool that we built as part of a broader project focused on service outsourcing triads. The overall project was led by Mei Lee, a bright young assistant professor at Michigan State University who happened to get her PhD at Arizona State University a number of years back, Professor Tom Choi from SCAPS Research, and Nikhil Chugh, who was an MBA and Masters of Business Analytics student that is now working for ON Semiconductor. The emphasis on the project is on the service outsourcing triad. Well, what do we mean by a service outsourcing triad? In the service outsourcing triad, you have a buying organization, you have a supplier who's going to provide that service to the customer. And we're particularly interested in the Excel tool on how much monitoring we should do of the supplier on the supplier side and on the customer side. And ultimately, if we do enough monitoring on the supplier side, we end up doing some additional monitoring between the supplier and the customer itself. Okay, before I talk much more about the tool, I'd like to give you just a brief overview of the overall project.
So the project started with interviews of key personnel in a number of different companies, different industries. You can see in this slide the different numbers of employees, different sizes, etc., to gather the information overall about service outsourcing. One of the key aspects that we found was really important was how you monitor, both monitoring the supplier and monitoring the customer when you're the buying firm. We ended up discussing things at three different levels: a hands-off monitoring, a light touch monitoring, and a heavy touch monitoring. And those are pretty much as implied by the names. So in the tool that I'm going to discuss in just a moment, we ended up calling those levels low, medium, and high, and are interested in what's the impact of those different monitoring levels. So here's some of the things that we found in terms of what were the ingredients for a successful service outsourcing project. I will leave these for you just to look at, but refer you then to the report for much more detail about this. And I very much encourage you to get a copy of the report from SCAPS Research. So again, the tool is going to focus on how much monitoring we do once a supplier is selected. So we've selected the supplier. We're now going to decide how much should we monitor the supplier and how much should we monitor the customer. And as we monitor the supplier more, it's going to lead into looking at the link between the supplier and the customer. So we would get much more involved in that part of the operation. So the Excel tool that we've developed, there's really two main aspects to the tool. One is determining how much to monitor for what we're going to call a single project. That's a single servicing outsourcing encounter. And this gives a little graphic on the user sets. The user is going to supply information on a particular project. They're going to have to indicate who the supplier is. They're going to do something called the monitoring matrix, supply some information that says how much impact is there if I monitor at the low, medium, or high level. I'll explain each of those in just a moment, for an individual project. We also have the ability within this tool to consider multiple projects at the same time. It may be that in your particular situation, you would really like to monitor all of them very heavily, but you've got limited headcount or limited budget in order to be able to do that. And so the multiple project optimization takes a look at each of the projects, what its requirements are in terms of headcount and required in terms of dollars, and then tries to come up with the best overall combination of monitoring that you should do based on the priority of the different encounters. So let's jump into the tool. So the first, as I indicated, is supplier information. This is simply information that you would want to keep in a spreadsheet about service outsourcing anyway. And so we use this name over here on the supplier in the other sheets of the tool. So the monitoring matrix is a separate sheet that looks at how much monitoring we do both on the supplier side and on the customer side. So you see that in the second and third columns. And then we use as a baseline a low level of monitoring of both the supplier and the customer. So you see the purple row across the top shows that there's zero impact on the performance parameters because that's the baseline. Then the user supplies the elements in blue, in the light blue, that indicate the what the impact is on the internal cost if I increase monitoring on either the supplier side or the customer side. So you see, for instance, if we go medium, that would say there's the internal cost are 20% more. All the rest of the columns, from the contract cost out to the risk, the five most right columns, are going to be impacted by the information that's given down below. Okay, so the user estimates those, changes the monitoring, and then these are values that you can fill in your own information, or you can use this information derived from May Lee's dissertation back in 2011 that indicates what the ratio of increase is in, say, quality to increase in monitoring level investment. So this one, if we look at the low-medium, says, well, if we end up going from low to medium, that is, we're doing more monitoring on the customer side, and it takes a 10% increase in our internal cost. If we multiply that by the 0.21, which is that ratio of the increase, we end up getting a 0.24 increase. It's the 0.1 times the 0.2. It says 4 there, but really 0.4. All right, so we specify this information, and then that's going to be used in the other parts of the spreadsheet tool. So then what we do for an individual project that we're considering, so we've already selected the supplier, now we're on the individual project, we're going to end up doing something very similar to a supplier selection sheet, except that instead of looking at individual suppliers across the top row of the spreadsheet here, we're looking at the different levels of monitoring that we're doing and indicating what the score will be in these 11 different categories, 9 categories and 2 that the user can supply. So we've tried to make the tool flexible in that regard. And we end up with a score based on that and a weight for each of the categories. You'll see in a moment that we have a separate sheet or a separate area for supplying information about the supplier capability, about the cost and contract terms, etc. So we'll come back to that. But ultimately, we end up, based on the weights that we've picked for the different categories and the scores that we get from the lower level that we'll see in a moment, we end up getting an overall score for each of the projects. And I'm trying to show that here, that in this case, a 3.21 has the highest overall score, so that we would consider that the best choice for this particular encounter. Now, obviously, you don't want to take that blindly, but that at least gives you some information on which options you should consider. In addition, we need a cost estimate and the full-time equivalent estimates, how much the headcount is. And the user can either supply those and fill in the light blue fields, or the information from the monitoring matrix that we talked about before will be plugged in the fields that are in white here. So we end up with internal full-time equivalents, internal cost, contract cost, and the total cost to the company for each of the projects. Okay? And again, this is completely configurable by the user in terms of the different weights on the different categories and actually on the elements of those categories. So if I look at supplier capability and cost contract terms, for instance, if I have a separate sheet for this particular project that will look at the information about that. And you can see that the user can then supply weights for the elements within a category. So supplier capability has more to do. There's more than just one number there. There's actually the different fields that they can fill in, each with a separate weight that will all get rolled together into one big score. So again, here the user is going to supply this information and rank these different categories, give them a score, and all that gets rolled up into an overall score. So you might notice that so you get the monitoring matrix will come into play, and automatically populate and apply that factor that we looked at to these terms. That is for those elements that are in the gray here. The gray elements are impacted by the monitoring matrix. The others are not. For instance, you notice the supplier capability doesn't have any one of those. Because we're picking the same supplier, there's no reason there for there to be a difference in those scores. All right, so that's what the gray indicates. And you'll see that, again, there's some that are not impacted. Okay, so we then take those scores that we end up getting from the matrix. Those get fed back up into the spreadsheet portion that I showed you before. All right, and gives you those overall scores that we saw before. Next, we have that information, and that information is going to get fed now for multiple projects. So I should have indicated, if you only have the one project, then you use this information that's along here to try to help guide you in terms of, which option is the best. However, if we want to consider multiple projects with a constraint on the amount of headcount and the amount of budget, we move on to this portion below that does a summary of that information for what's important. So you'll see here the same information here, but there's now a row here that also indicates, do we choose this option or do we not choose that? So the user can also specify whether to include the project in the optimization or not, because this is going across projects. In some cases, you may not want to consider the project, a given project in the optimization, but it's still in the spreadsheet, so you need to be able to indicate yes or no. You can also specify right above that the strategic importance of the project. So you're going to get a total weighted score across all the projects, but some projects may be more important to you than others, and so you want to weight them more heavily. So whichever monitoring level is selected, the corresponding cell will become a 1 once we run the optimization. So you can see here there's 3 projects specified at this point. They all have zeros in them. Okay, so none of those are selected yet for the optimization. Though I could say again that the low would be the best choice for project 1. For project 2, it looks like the best one is the 2.91. So it's a high. So that obviously shows on the tool that it's not universal on which one's the best one. It depends on the different characteristics. And on the third one, it looks like 2.85, a medium high is the best option. But it may not be able to do all 3 of those because of the budget constraints and the headcount constraints, which are specified down in the lower information about each project. Okay? So that leads us to an optimization where we could say, what is the best to do? If imagine that we had a $19 million budget and we could only have 40 full-time equivalent headcounts. This is what happens before we run the optimization. Notice there's a 0 here. They're all at 0. Once we run the optimization, we decided that we would do low, high-low, and medium-high for the project. Remember, that's not the same that we would have picked if we'd had an unlimited budget, an unlimited headcount. And you can see we used almost all the budget and almost all the headcount. And it gave us an overall cumulative score, and that's what it's trying to maximize, is this overall cumulative score across all the projects with the weights given for each project below. So that came out of the optimization. And so you see now that we chose, these are the ones that we chose, that information is back here. And that's not the best that we would have done necessarily on each of the projects if we could do it all themselves, right? So we would have gone a high here on the second project if we could have. So and this is all done through Excel Solver, which is available as an add-in to Excel, no additional cost. You just go into the add-in section and load it, and you have it there. So if you end up having any questions about anything I've talked about today or about the overall project, feel free to contact me at the information given on the screen. Thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing from you.